Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast, where we talk about the intellectual tools that lead to not only self-defense, but moral use of force when it's appropriate. The maybe a little bit aggressive in a way to enter into the show, but today's subject is a subject that I've wanted to talk about for a long time, but it's going to require a little bit of a foundation before we get into it effectively. However, it is one that has not only been pertinent in recent history, even much further than that, but it's something that I fully expect to see utilized as not only a tactic, but a theology in the upcoming year, and that is the idea of preemptive self-defense. Now, if you are familiar with what the kinds of things that oftentimes get brought up in like a concealed carry course or even in a use of force, rules of engagement type conversation, whether it's law enforcement, military, or an individual citizen, you'll hear that string of words, preemptive self-defense, and already be suspicious of it because the idea of defense implies that there's an attacker, but if you're defending yourself before being attacked, it kind of isn't really defense, right? But this language is used oftentimes, and I've read through a series of books tying them all together that have to do with this as not necessarily just a tactic, but as a theology. It is a belief on the level of religion that is the root cause. Now, you may have heard people like James Lindsay or Tim Pool talk about the strategy, maybe more appropriate in our phrasing, the tactic of preemptive self-defense, where it is manifested in the idea of eliciting a response for the sake of justifying the cause. But and we'll get through that in a second. So before we get any further, thank you for listening. And this is the Redacted Culture Cast, episode 181 on preemptive self-defense. Now, if you want to support the show, head over to redactedllc.com, and if you want to join in the conversation, there's redactedculture.locals.com. That's where you can find a lot of the work there, as well as some of the stuff that just can't get put on YouTube. So, let's start with a model. If we start at the level of the individual and abstract it from there, we can start to build and make sense of words like strategy, tactic, technique, skill, theology, worldview in this framework. Whenever you are dealing with, say, use of force, when we're talking about whether it's learning how to draw a handgun, learning how to draw a handgun begins with a technique. How do I do the thing? And then a skill, someone becomes skilled in that, not only that technique, but in the application of that technique, whether it's in a self-defense case or in a competition scenario. So we start with technique and then we get to a skill. And then from skill, though, we're going to start to deal, if you go abstract it one layer further, we're going to start talking about tactics. And tactics, which is a word that was mostly corrupted by marketing majors in the early 2000s, applies to the way that somebody sees a goal that is, in a sense, pertinent to a larger one, being strategy. This is not a technical definition, but it's used for this conversation. And so we're starting with the abstractions from the individual, starting with technique, skill, tactic. And a tactic is a combination of techniques, oftentimes in coordination with other people, in order to achieve victory in a conflict. Then from there, we might look at strategy. And so strategy, if you could think of this as a chessboard, from the mindset of someone playing chess, you're not dealing with skills or techniques, you're dealing with, or even tactics, you're dealing with strategy, because you're assuming that when you take a piece with another piece, that the techniques or the tactics involved are successful because of how it works. Now, so that this is why chess is a game of strategy, not necessarily a tactical one. Maybe even think about it as tactics apply to specific situations, a specific mission, a specific raid, a specific activity, or a short-term goal, whereas a strategy leads to something much longer. Strategies are for winning wars. tactics are for winning battles and completing operations. But what is one layer more abstracted from a strategy? What is it that informs how a strategy should operate? What is it? What is it? Is it values, such as they value victory or survival? Is it whatever it is that informs oneself of values? This is why. This is where I want to address the idea of why the language that surrounds the concept of preemptive self-defense is so dangerous in our day and age, and start to address ways that we can handle it, or not even react, but address it appropriately. So the idea of preemptive, sometimes loosely referred to as premeditated self-defense, is not it's not actually all that new. It's just received fresh fervor. And if we only look at it as a tactic, then we are going to fail on the level of the theology or the philosophy of it. Preemptive self-defense, or preemptive self-defense in this sense, on the level of a tactic, can be understood as moral, but on the level of a theology, that's where it gets dubious. So think of it this way, right? It's a politically contentious way where preemptive self-defense might be used in a riot or a protest or a current contemporary American street politics, and that is where somebody is seeking to frame, maybe through in a sort of propagandistic sense, a event or a circumstance in a light that shows in their favor, and they're going to do this through nefarious editing or clips or whatever. And you see this happen in protests every once in a while. I mean, a lot of what took place in Minneapolis, and you see this kind of, that's not even called a phenomenon, but this tactic repeat itself over time, especially in the political sphere. So you'll have people who refer to themselves as a protest, hinting at the Motte and Bailey here, and what they'll do is they'll instigate a fight or a conflict with whatever is their target, and then they'll film the reaction as if that reaction was part of their identity all along. And so this would be something like, this happens even in rhetoric and in argumentation as well, where somebody will engage in what might be a Kafka trap, which is, you are a racist, and if you do not think that you're a racist, that is a sign that you are a racist. Only a racist would say that he's not a racist. And so it's a play on words, and it's a rhetorical trap that puts a person in a position where if they defend themselves, even the act of their defense is further seen as evidence for guilt. You see this kind of mentality take place also in conspiracy theories, where the absence of evidence is somehow twisted as evidence for the theory's existence. And this is why the tie between, say, your wildest conspiracy theories and the ideology of Black Lives Matter is not very different, but we're not going to throw punches at that level. In fact, we're going to start working on books here in a second. And so when we think of self-defense and we think of this idea of preemptive self-defense on the level of a tactic, we might also look at it in a better light in a bona fide war situation where two nations have declared war on each other, and one unit of a unit, squad, platoon, company, whatever, of one army and one nation moves to attack another, knowing that they're going to be traveling on a certain route. So if I knew that your platoon was going to attack my platoon along this direction, a preemptive form of, not necessarily self-defense because it's technically in a war situation, but let's just humor me on the level of tactics, would be an ambush. It would be to set up an ambush for them so that you attack them before they actually attack you. Now, this is all fair and good because in a war scenario, we have taken on the assumption that at least above the level of the tactic, the two armies are in conflict with one another. And if we're going to step into an entirely different question on the morality of killing in war, we'd have to address somebody like McMahon. But today, we're talking about the idea of what happens when the concept of preemptive self-defense transcends the tactic and gets ingrained into the ideology of somebody. So I'm going to read a couple of lines. I've taken a couple of lines and pages from a series of books here, but starting with the Antifa Handbook. And I want to read this paragraph here on 169. There are three main arguments that anti-fascists use to justify their occasional violence. First, as explained in Chapter 4, anti-fascists make a historical argument based on the accurate observation that rational debate and the institutions of government have failed to consistently halt the rise of fascism. Given that fact, they argue that the only hope to prevent a sequel is to physically prevent any potential fascist advance. Second, they point out that the many successful examples of militant anti-fascism shutting down or severely hampering far-right organizing since the end of World War II. And third, fascist violence often necessitates self-defense. Although anti-fascists challenge conventional interpretations of self-defense grounded in individualistic personal ethics by legitimating offensive tactics in order to forestall the potential need for literal self-defense down the line. It's that last sentence that is most important. Third, and I'll read it again, third, fascist violence often necessitates self-defense. Although anti-fascists challenge conventional interpretations of self-defense grounded in individualistic personal ethics by legitimating offensive tactics in order to forestall the potential need for literal self-defense down the line. In other words, geez, I need to fix my mic. In other words, actually this is even his own words. This is going to be the continuation of page 169. Nice. In other words, anti-fascists don't wait for fascist threat to become violent before acting to shut it down, physically if necessary. So what you see there is you have this argument that in order to prevent the inevitable violence that is going to come from fascists, an anti-fascist is permitted to use violence as a diversity of tactics. Now, not only is this argument in itself rather morally dubious because it assumes that the individual is capable of discerning who is and is not actually a fascist, it also is morally dubious on the level of theology because it separates mankind into two types. We've seen this done before, particularly with biological Darwinism, which was used as a justification for the separation of people on the basis of race, which Ibram X. Kendi found displeasing, and all conveniently, so do we. But the idea here is even deeper because instead of it just being in your nature what Mark Bray ends up dealing with is the problem that there is something within the nature of a person which makes them a fascist, which is going to mean they will inevitably do a fascism. And so the only way to defend, or the best way to defend against a fascism, is to use preemptive self-defense against the declared fascist. Now, let's take a look at what this means. All of mankind can then be separated into two groups according to this ideology, and there are the oppressor and the oppressed. And the oppressed, in this sense, the anti-fascist, who always will view himself as the oppressed, has the right ad infinitum to do a violence against a fascist so long as they identify them as a fascist. Proper definitions be damned, I guess. But this is the problem, too, because it views the person that they determine to be a fascist as subhuman or abhuman or other than human, other a different type of human than them. And that is the problem. That is exactly where the ideology takes place. So the problem with, and that was the anti-fascist handbook by Mark Bray. The problem with the ideology in this sense of preemptive self-defense is that, according to this self-written Antifa handbook or anti-fascist handbook, is that they are ontologically, well, in a sense, ontologically, they are dividing mankind into two categories without using words like species or genome, but they are dividing them into the fascist and the anti-fascist. It is the fascist is a specific type of person which cannot be helped from doing a fascist, because you can't argue with them, you can't reason with them. You just must use force to prevent them from doing the inevitable force that they're going to use on you. And that is the point. When we think about self-defense or even the use of force, we recognize that people are people, that all human beings, whether Afghanis, Americans, Koreans, Chinese, whatever your nationality, or whether you are tall or short, man or woman, they are people. And so it is not on the basis of some category, even as not necessarily arbitrary, but abstract as the Antifa handbook. We look at people as people. That means we are concerned about the moral use of force, regardless of whether it's legal first, and then we also are concerned about its legality. Whereas in the anti-fascist handbook, Mark Bray says it's quite the opposite. It is always justified in any time for a person who self-declares themselves as the anti-fascist to use force to stifle, disrupt, and defeat the fascist. And I've been using the word fascist way too much in this conversation because it's just really annoying. And we all know, and I mean, I'm just going to take it a little bit in this episode, assumed that the term fascist or fascism is so loosely used, much like the term Christian nationalist, that it can very easily be applied to just about anything. Anyone who opposes me is a fascist, because they are trying to impede on my will. But another book to consider is Barbara F. Walter, How Civil Wars Start. And in this book, on, let's see, what are my page notes? We've got page 66. She brings up here you go. She brings up this concept that one of the factors that leads to the likelihood of civil war, or increases the likelihood of civil war, is whenever you have a dominant group in a country, because we're talking about mostly political philosophy in this book, about a country. So we might start with some prerequisites. Civil war is a war that takes place within the borders of a country between members of that country. So it kind of preemptively holds a somewhat von Clausewitz mentality, or I'm sorry, of a somewhat von Clausewitz worldview, where governments, like warfare is specifically between governments. It has a primarily political attitude. Therefore, war is politics by another means. But in this sense, she's talking about how it is downgrading factions. So assume that you have a country, and that country is splintering into factions, and one of those factions has held a dominant position within that country for some time. And then what happened? One thing that is a factor which increases the likelihood of a civil war in that country would be the loss of power. Let's see, the loss of dominance. Maybe they've a sudden or a feeling of loss of market capture or ideological strength or ideological solidarity in the country, and as a result, those people who are in this sentence, I'll read two sentences. Human beings hate to lose. This is going to be a whole paragraph starting on 65. Human beings hate to lose. They hate to lose money, games, jobs, respect, partners, and yes, status. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated this in a series of experiments in which they asked subjects if they'd be willing to accept a gamble, where if they had 50% chance in winning, say $100, but an equal chance of losing $100, they found that most people refused to gamble. The reason? Human beings are loss averse. They are much more motivated to try to reclaim losses than they are to try to make gains. People may tolerate years of poverty, unemployment, and discrimination. They may accept shoddy schools, poor hospitals, and neglected infrastructure. But there is one thing they will not tolerate: losing status in a place they believe is theirs. In the 21st century, the most dangerous factions are once dominant groups facing decline. And this is something that is worth observing in her book, How Civil Wars Start, because she has a number of chapters which seem to be, in a sense, very academically encouraging. She is looking at factors that increase the likelihood of civil war in a country. But later on in the book, let's just actually go a couple pages later on to 75. Well, that was the economic one, and we're kind of pulling that one away. But we're going to go on here to page 81, and you see this you can see where that is set up to not necessarily be a trap, but a danger in the sense of this case. Page 181 in my edition starts with, and yet, if there's another civil war, those will be its soldiers. She's talking about Boogaloo Boys, which, I mean, this book aged like milk. Like, it didn't age well. A lot of her examples didn't age well, and I think she actually approached it in a less academic sense, so there's some grace there. Not everything has to be a mudslinging contest. And yet, if there's another civil war, these will be its soldiers, again referring to the Boogaloo Boys. There are hundreds of far-right groups in America today that believe the country needs a major conflict to right itself. Their names may change. The Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and the Oath Keepers are the biggest at the moment, but they agree on similar goals. Most want the government out of their lives. They want fewer laws and restrictions on their freedoms. An increasing number of them want white Christian men in charge, and all of them believe that violence is the way to make their vision a reality. So this is where that preemptive self-defense is being set up. You're seeing a case here where she might be describing something that is, by all intents and purposes, either it's not even factual, but it's just sort of a description of what's going on. But then she slides in at the end that they believe that violence is necessary in order to achieve their outcomes. And when that gets snuck in at the end, now you see the not the motivation, but you see the prerequisite, the moral prerequisite being staged and set up for a use of force. And while I don't think Barbara F. Walter and How Civil Wars Start is supposed to be a ideological predecessor to Malcolm Nance's They Want to Kill Americans, one thing that is useful about Nance is how frank he is, sometimes even defying or challenging the idea of whether or not he means what he says. Alrighty. So, from page 60, I was supposed to start on 51. From page 51, we have the terrorist element of the Trump insurgency of the United States has already used propaganda by deed, where their deadly acts are designed to incite further violence and stir the imagination of those who are not yet convinced of the efficacy of terror. Each act is designed to weaken the resolve of the public and make them feel the government cannot protect them. Within social media infosphere, the extreme right-wing, particularly that on Reddit, Parler, Gab, and Telegram chat rooms, the glorification of murdering liberals is commonplace. And then quoting some random person is fun. But the most militant armed members of Titus, this is from page 50, take an eliminationist view towards liberal values most Americans see as mainstream. These extremists believe that direct defiance, often with violence or the threat of violence, will halt the corruption of government. Many Titus extremists favor the elimination, arrest, or execution of political enemies. Political groups and individuals, particularly the judicial branches, judges, and staffs, are often threatened and when unfavorable results are enshrined into law. And then he talks about what he identifies as the political fringe, but an event that many of us are familiar with, involving one Kyle Rittenhouse, quote, page 51 into 50 into 51. The Trump insurgency of the United States has openly supported acts of terrorism and lionized perpetrators. 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot to death 2 liberal protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, became the symbol of the armed youth against progressive values. Patches and T-shirts with his image parading an AR-15 rifle are sold all around the nation. The shock of these images as propaganda allow terror or sympathizers and extremist media channels to evangelize their worldview before other Americans and help shame fence-sitters. So this is where you get into the level of a holy war. They believe that you are you should be subject to a holy war. Interesting. Even though it's kind of like the accuse you of doing something that I'm going to do to you. It's just consistent. So, from page 62, violent extremists in the United States and terrorists in the Middle East have remarkably similar pathways to radicalization. Both are motivated by a devotion to a charismatic leader, are successful at smashing political norms, and are promised a future racially homogeneous paradise. Most American terrorists are much more akin to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and than they are to the old Ku Klux Klan. Though they take offense at that comparison, similarities are quite remarkable. Most American extremists are not professional terrorists on par with their international counterparts. They lack operational proficiency and weapons, but they do not lack ruthlessness, targets, or ideology. However, the overwhelming number of white nationalist extremists operate as lone wolves, like Timothy McVeigh in the 1990s from the 1980s, and others from the 1980s. They hope that their acts will motivate the masses to follow in their footsteps. ISIS radicals who abandon their homes and immigrate to Syria border caliphate are exclusively self-radicalized by watching terrorist videos. And then he goes on to talk about the Mujahideen, which is hilarious. And then here's another quote. U.S. insurgents in the making are often watching YouTube and Facebook videos of tactical military operations, gear reviews, and shooting how-tos. They then go out to buy rifles, magazines, and ammunition, combat helmets, and camouflage clothing, and seek out other patriots to prepare for armed action. This is pure ISIS-like self-radicalization. One would call them vanilla ISIS. So that's Malcolm Nance, who isn't really a peacemaker. So why I tied these things together is because I want to conclude with this. The issue with the idea of preemptive self-defense is not only that it is a tactic that can be countered, but it actually exists on the level of an ideology. So Barbara F. Walters presents perhaps the most reasonable, not case, but argument that is tempered away from just harsh political rhetoric. Whereas in the anti-fascist handbook, the idea of preemptive self-defense is actually considered justified by the nature of what a fascist is. And in Malcolm Nance's case, that is you, if you own a gun and go to church. So, or if you just fit into whatever his target group is. But, so, where are we with this? What is the conclusion? The idea of preemptive self-defense is dangerous because we look at it as a moral dubious grounds. In order to be justified on a moral level, one would have to divide mankind into parts, and we see that as immoral in itself. Whereas, while it will present itself merely as a tactic or a strategy, it must be addressed at the level of the ideology. The people who call you fascist hate you and want to destroy you. So, beware of that. Do with it as you will, but most of all, remember our role first here is to be moral, and it is our goal to bring you the intellectual tools that are used to navigate today's times. That being the case, if you want to support us, you can head over to redactedllc.com. Go forth and conquer.